Thank you so much for having this hearing. I am the president of the Rebuild Local News and the chair of the Rebuild Local News Coalition, which is an alliance of more than 35 different national and state organizations that represent together about 3,000 newsrooms, labor unions, ethnic media, conservative rural weeklies, for-profits, nonprofits. It's a very broad coalition, and our goal is to find and advocate for public policies that will counter this collapse of local news while preserving editorial independence. That's a key point. As you noted, the crisis is really severe. There's new information from Medill University's most recent report that there's been a 68% drop in the number of journalists in California from 2005 to 2000. It's really staggering. And 160 newspapers having closed in California. So really thank you, Senator Glazer, for your focus on this through the fellowship program in general. And I also want to thank Assemblymember Wicks and Senator Umberg, as well as the California News Publishers Association and the News Media Alliance for their work on the California Journalism Preservation Act. And I think their efforts have brought a great deal of energy to helping solve this cause. I'm here to describe a few other complementary approaches that you might consider as well that are based in tax policy. And having studied a variety of different approaches, there is one clear winner, at least in terms of the breadth of support, and that is the idea of a local news employment tax credit. A version of this passed the U.S. House of Representatives in 2021. It's been endorsed by every major publisher group, labor unions, state press associations, and many others. And the federal version, the way it works is they use the payroll tax refund system as a way of providing subsidies to local newsrooms based on how many editorial employees that they have working on local news. So the subsidy in that case is equivalent to 50% of the reporter's wage up to $50,000 salary. So in other words, it could provide organizations with up to a $25,000 benefit per employee. So for example, here in Sacramento, you're lucky enough to have the Sacramento Observer, which does an outstanding job covering the black community here. They have 8 editorial staff, and they would get $190,000 in the first year. And Larry Lee, the publisher, tells me that that would enable them to hire more reporters and have more events in the community. In the federal version, I'd note that it's sunset after 5 years, and that the benefit drops from a maximum of $25,000 to $15,000 in years 2 through 5. You might want to consider a California twist on this, which would be to maintain the higher level if the newsroom maintains or increases their staff, sort of taking a page from PPP and creating those incentives. There's a lot to like about this approach. It's highly targeted to the core challenge, the lack of local reporting in communities. It has good incentives. If a newsroom adds reporters, they get a larger benefit. If they cut staff, they get a smaller benefit. It's easily accessible by smaller newsrooms. They don't have to hire a grant writer or a lobbyist. If the outlet qualifies, it files for it on its taxes, and the next quarter it gets a refund. We think this would be enormous benefit, especially to small rural weeklies, family-owned publications, ethnic media, and nonprofits, as well as the bigger players. It's future-friendly, which is to say that it doesn't only help the current established players. As new models emerge, as they will, they can benefit too, as long as they meet the basic criteria. Canada has a similar policy in effect for a couple years now. They call it the labor subsidy, and the early reports are encouraging. A study by the University of North Carolina found that all of the small publishers that they interviewed reported that the credit had increased their ability to hire reporters. So what would this cost? Now, our estimate is if you use the terms that are in the federal bill, which we think would help about 450 California newsrooms with about 3,000 reporters, using the model that the Joint Tax Committee created, it would come out to about $55 to $60 million cost per year for California to implement this. We are agnostic on exactly how to pay for this. I would note that as a matter of scale, based on KX's testimony, a tax of 0.5% on the three companies would pay for the entire employment credit tax program. But even without a pay for, I hope lawmakers seriously consider this, because there are enormous civic benefits to having healthy local news, which I think Matt Pierce will talk about a little bit. And I would add just one other thing that is even more pedestrian maybe, is that local journalism routinely saves governments and consumers billions of dollars. Whether it's uncovering waste in government or highlighting, corporate scams against consumers, or evidence of malfeasance that the Attorney General then uses to collect fines. So on a social level, broadly speaking, offering a tax credit for local news employment will likely pay for itself. And one thing this approach does not do is attempt to police based on the quality of the newsroom or the ideology. Some tax benefits would therefore no doubt end up supporting publications or TV stations that we might not like individually, but we believe that that kind of broad-minded approach is the way to provide the support while preserving editorial independence. And instead of the newsrooms collapsing and closing, they would have a real shot at covering their communities. Now, from there, they still have to make the case to their residents that they're serving them well. There are a few other tax ideas that I'll mention quickly. The federal bill also includes a second idea, which is a tax credit for small businesses that advertise in local news. So it goes to restaurants and grocery stores and other small businesses. So under the federal bill, it would be 50% of the value up to a $10,000 advertising spend. So if a small business in Alameda purchased $5,000 worth of advertising in the Alameda Post, the business would get $2,500 rebate. So in this case, no government agency is deciding who gets the ads. It's the small businesses that are making that decision based on their view of who's going to be most effective. Thirdly, a tax credit for subscriptions or donations to local news. We love this idea in concept. This was in an earlier federal version. It's really one of the best ideas in principle because you're empowering consumers to help support local news, and they make the choices about which local news they think is best. To be honest, as we got into this, we found a couple glitches in the policy. One was that, at least on the federal level, it would only go to itemizers, and there was really no guarantee that most of the tax benefit wouldn't go to people who are already paying for subscriptions instead of trying to generate new ones. But we love the concept and would be happy to work with you to try to figure out how to do that. And then lastly, I would say that there are ways of using the tax system to encourage what we call replanting, which is to say encouraging local communities to acquire or retain newspapers so they don't get sold to hedge funds or to out-of-state companies. So you could give tax benefits to local nonprofits or public benefit corporations that acquire newspapers. You could have something that Illinois just proposed was a 120-day waiting period on when a newspaper is going to be sold to an out-of-state company to allow for a community to organize around that. We have other examples in the written testimony of other ways of helping local news and elaboration on these tax ideas. I guess the last thing I would say is that the revised version of the California Journalism Preservation Act, we think could be useful if it were targeted toward California publishers and focused on investing in journalism rather than based on traffic. But we have a lot of detail on all of these ideas that we're happy to provide for you, and thank you again for focusing your attention on this.
Any thoughts about, for a lot of these smaller outlets that can't rely on a full-time, other ways that our tax spending side can help?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there are ways of constructing it so that you could essentially take some amount of money and count it as an FTE. Like if you aggregate X amount of money spent on stringers, freelance, and contractors editorially, adding it up to being an FTE or a half of an FTE, so that the newsroom would be able to benefit from that as well. In some cases, the newsroom may want to convert their part-time people into employees if they have and that would be great too. We've had a number of people who said, we have these folks as contractors and stringers, but if this existed, we'd probably make them an employee. But I think if we could come up with a way that would also deal with the fact that, especially at very small levels, that is the reality, that a lot of them do rely heavily on freelance.
Mr. Waldman.
I think the other factor is that consumers feel overwhelmed by information and news. So if you talk to a regular person who's not in the industry and you say there's a local news shortage, they look at you with a strange face. What do you mean shortage? I'm just absolutely drowning in information. The shortage, of course, is in local reporting. But I think part of what has maybe taken a little while for people to realize the severity of the crisis and the implications for communities is that there's a kind of national news avalanche. At the same time, there's this severe local news shortage.
Mr. Waldman, as Mr. Pierce has indicated, government has played a role in supporting independent journalism here in America and around the world. And people think, is this the exception to the rule? And maybe you could speak to examples of in England with the BBC and other places where, in an appropriate way, and if they're inappropriate, you should say, because we don't want one party controlling the news, as we understand is happening in Hungary. Could you speak to that?
Yeah, we actually, in the United States, relative to the rest of the world, we actually spend a smaller percentage of budget and GDP to support media than other countries, but we still have had very significant support for the media or policy that has helped over the years. The postal subsidy that the Founding Fathers created literally in their first Congress, it was actually one of the first acts or social programs that they created, was a massive subsidy for the newspaper industry in the form of having lower postage rates for newspapers to be sent around. In modern dollars, it would be about $40 billion a year, about the size of the NASA budget that the government was saying support. But it's really interesting to look at why that worked. It wasn't, Ben Franklin sitting there with, Federalist and Jeffersonian papers deciding which were good and saying these should get a benefit and these shouldn't. It was a broad-based benefit that helped all sorts of different newspapers, including ones that, George Washington hated. And they just accepted that because they said, we have to lift up the whole field in a fair way. And it was accepted by the public for that same reason. And that's why I think we end up coming back to some of these tax ideas, because even though it's not about postal subsidies, the principles of the tax ideas are actually the same as the principles that were in the postal subsidy. Simple standards that are universal, that would be applied to a broad range of people. And one encouraging thing is that on this federal bill, which includes the employment tax credit and the tax credit for small businesses that advertise, has now been endorsed by the National Restaurant Association, 21 Republicans and 21 Democrats. So what we are finding is that this particular approach is viewed as more neutral, and that legislators of all different ideologies are making a distinction, even the ones that are very, very critical of mainstream media and would rather not help national media, still are seeing the importance of local news. And that ultimately it's not in their minds about helping keep jobs for reporters. I'm not sure everyone cares about that. It's that it's doing real harm to the communities. It's making communities poorer, less informed, less able to address their problems, have higher taxes. And so that I think it is absolutely true. I mean, this is kind of a funny coalition because it's like a coalition of people who would really rather not be there. Like no one really is rushing to the idea that, let's get the government to help. But everyone has really come to the conclusion that the crisis is so severe and the consequences to democracy and the health of communities are so grave that we really do need to look at careful First Amendment friendly policies, and that fortunately they do exist. They can be done.